Okay, there we go. Now we're on. Um, I also really liked the poetry. That helped me. That helped me put my mind in the right place. Uh huh. Okay, then we'll have to stop. All right. Well, not now, but we may have some crying children that will need
Oh, for sure,
some
yeah.
attendance, as you understand fully. So, but anyway, we'll go in the meantime.
Yes.
So, uh, it would be kind of fun to tell some of the stories of what we're up to politically. So, and this is a few things that I've been pretty well involved in. So maybe I could speak on that a little bit.
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay, so I mean, what I'm it's interesting we're getting these attacks from multiple sides, um, because what I am noticing is just that I think that the thesis that I've been sort of working with over the past 6 months or so is proving true, which is that the whole political future of the United States, all political spectrum, is going to revolve in large part around the relationship to China. And I don't mean like the relationship of states, although of the nations, although inherently that is what it is, but not in the way that most people think about it. I think it's a relationship between the peoples. You know, the people of China, the people of the United States. Are you checking out our Twitch stream? Is it working out? Yeah? Okay, good.
Yeah, it's going through.
Okay, good. But anyway, I think it does have to do with that because the the people who are um, every human being in the United States is noticing the fact that we're descending into barbarism. That there's 500,000 people who are homeless in the United States. That there are these videos that go viral from the streets of Philadelphia of people stumbling by on heroin, completely out of their minds, and that stretches for like a block or several blocks or worse. The tent cities that we're seeing everywhere, or not quite everywhere, not yet, but all over. And I mean, I was in Manhattan the other day, which I'll say more about, and you really can't walk down the street without encountering someone in broad daylight who is out of their mind on drugs. I presumably heroin, but I don't know exactly what else. So the fact that people are suffering so terribly, um, and 600,000 people died in the midst of the pandemic, then you think to yourself, okay, but then what's going on in the rest of the world? Finally, it's like the American public are able to consider the rest of the world, which is a huge American problem. This kind of parochialism, this inability to look beyond our own borders, and what I think everyone is noticing, no matter what political region you find yourself landed in, is that in China there seems to be something wholly different, and that there are things that are being done there that demonstrate very clearly that the Chinese government treats its population with a level of dignity that the people in the United States do not receive. And it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with the Evergrande thing, or Evergrande, or whatever it is. Because it seems quite likely that the foreign, bondholders and so forth, that the UBSs and the Goldman Sachs or whatever who are holding all of this money, they're gonna get stuck holding the bag, and the Chinese government is not going to allow its system to be completely, detonated by the international financial oligarchy, which would really love to do that. And that's why they have Glass-Steagall. That's why they have, national banking. So what is I think that the fact that people are looking to China brings them sort of into certain coherence with what the LaRouche movement has been doing for decades, essentially since our inception, but especially in the past 30 years, which is to promote the conception of a community of shared future, a community of nation states acting on a principle, and that principle being progress, increases in relative potential population density, mega projects, beautiful, gigantic projects as laid out by LaRouche in the Earth's Next 50 Years, in many other of his major publications, and those projects are being built right now with the Belt and Road, and so the whole ideology, the whole problem of ideology, as it regards China, is sort of running into reality. And that's why I think that's the context for what these people, the Chow Collective, have been doing. And I talked to a couple of them at the conference that they held in coordination with Code Pink at the People's Forum in Manhattan, which is on 37th Street. That's where I saw these people totally whacked out on heroin, standing in the street. Like every time I go to Manhattan, I see someone urinate in the street or doing drugs. And of course, you're constantly walking through clouds of marijuana smoke, so you can't avoid that at all. So I went to this conference with a couple of friends who were members of the LaRouche organization, and we went in, and there was a large crowd, like a good 150 people, who were like 80% people in their 20s and 30s. A lot of people who were very interested to know about China and the left, which was the subject of the conference. And there were a number of really good presentations about the role of the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa, for example, and also the situation, the poverty eradication policy, the effectiveness and the way that they did it. Extensive report on that, which was quite good. But basically, at the same time that this was going on, and the Chow Collective was sort of declaring their commitment to the idea that if you're on the left, if you call yourself an anti-imperialist, you have to be pro-China in the distinction between China and the U.S., which I surely appreciate that commitment. But what we at the same time, there was, in coordination with this guy Vijay Prashad, to some extent, I don't know exactly how, but he seemed to be directing the people who were passing out a pamphlet, a brochure called Demystifying Degrowth, which was, according to the pamphlet, and I mean, it's just like this ridiculous cartoonish thing of like a cartoon planet Earth, like looking around. Their logo is a snail. Their logo is a snail, like a happy little snail who goes slow, because slow is good. Small is good, and slow is good. And I'm just going to tell the story briefly, and then I want to see what you think about it, including like in what sense this is being promulgated. But I said to the person, without having read the brochure, I talked to this young woman, and I said, well, so what is the idea in terms of the economic development of the underdeveloped regions of the world? And she kind of looked at me blankly. And I said, well, what do you think we should do in terms of hospitals for Sierra Leone? And she kind of looked at me blankly. And I said, do you think we need to degrow Sierra Leone or Afghanistan? Do you think we need to degrow Afghanistan? Do you think we need to degrow, China? You can tell China to degrow? And her response, which by the way is identical to the response that I got the next day by a certain significant figure, Medea Benjamin of Code Pink, was that no, what we need to do is reduce consumption among rich countries and increase, redistribute things, redistribute information, redistribute power, redistribute I don't know, redistribute.
Redistribute carbon footprint.
Yeah, something like that. I don't know, just like redistribute. That's the only that's the word that they kept on using to the to the poor countries. So I said, okay, so how are you going to redistribute power plants? How does that work? And she said she didn't have an answer. And I said, how are you going to get the electricity to Sierra Leone? Because you do think they should have electricity so they can have hospitals, right? But the pamphlet is so fantastical. It includes the idea you should look for types of work that don't require consumption, like teaching children. So I guess they're promoting the idea that instead of having a school, you could just have like a cave. You could have like a nice dirt area and just have the kids all in the dirt, and then you could draw in the dirt, and that would be a nice way of teaching them. And if the kids want lunch, you can just say, I'm sorry, we don't do consumption around here, and they can eat later, when they go home to their home caves. And so this is pretty outrageous. So then I went ahead and tried to talk to the woman at who gave the keynote of Chow Collective, and the young degrowth lady who's dressed up, early 20s, dressed up in kind of a New York style, and she got the ear of the Chow Collective representative for about 5 minutes before I came up and talked, and then the Chow Collective person just started running away from me, as quickly as possible, walking around the room and completely avoiding me. And when I finally, flagged her down, then she said, no, and I realized that I had been labeled as a person not to be spoken to, a fascist of some type, right? So anyway, that's what went on Saturday, and then, like I said, yesterday at the United Nations General Assembly, I ran into Medea Benjamin, and I brought this up to her, and she expressed the fact that she felt the same way. She said, I don't use degrowth, I don't use that word, but yes, I think we need to reduce consumption in the West and then redistribute. So this is, I think, what we're really the most heinous thing that we're up against. I think that, the fact that the leading anti-war organization in terms of headlines, for example, and they've done a lot of good things in that respect, as far as I can tell, but the fact that they are not just going along with the idea of CO2 reduction, let's say, but which is evil already, beyond, terribly evil, but that they're going along with this idea of redistribution from the rich countries to the poor, which is so divorced from anything real that has to do with anything in the real economy. I just wonder how these people can look at, they can be against drone strikes, but then they're not against, mass poverty. Or they're not willing to do anything about it that violates their essential presumptions about the nature of man as being some kind of a cancer. And so you have this vicious cynicism that is clearly orchestrated by the Bloombergs and the other Ubermenschen, the Carneys, and their associates, including, I presume, many other people we're going to find out about. So that's what I wanted to share with you.
Well, maybe with between Code Pink and the Biden administration, maybe they came to some sort of middle ground. I feel like with the Afghanistan situation, where if you're talking about how do you redistribute power plants, they showed it was an effective sort of case study of how you could redistribute something like attack helicopters to certain parts of the world that had before just 2 weeks ago. You maybe have that sort of major machinery, but like you're saying, clearly, Bloomberg's individual actions, sort of media empire that he owns, a lot of what I hear you report from this, it seems like a narrative that's been building up for decades now. Or if you go to an original Malthusian position, you could talk about that trade, maybe even further than that. And it seems like one of the biggest cultural weaknesses we have where you don't have something like a science of economy. Like, and what's called economics doesn't get anything close to like an actual register of real scientific thinking, so that what you have then is just, you know, this popular magical thinking about things, where things get into like these strange linearized board games almost, where it's like, oh, okay, just take the energy chips from this sector and put those energy chips over here then. And it's essentially, you know, like most board games are, it's an essentially physiocratic position.
Yeah.
You're like, here are set resources. Let's find out, you know, it's actually, you can make there are a couple German-style board games that mimic this somewhat, where it's like, here's your set amount of resources, let's just figure out the distribution lines in order to have the most sort of functioning economy with the resources that we have. And it seems where, you know, I don't know how far you can go without making common this sort of sense of what Lynn learned about with physical economy, and this necessity of advancement of the common good in a universal way, how that's needed to even have anything you could call sustainability.
Yeah.
Keeping things as they are, zero growth is not sustainable.
You know, I think there's going to be, we're going to have to, how do we raise this properly? Maybe I'll talk about it slightly differently. I mean, there has been a redefinition by some people of the idea of sustainability, because it's obvious, like, God, we do need a rectification. Thank you, of the names on this idea of sustainability, because if we're going to sustain life or sustain the human species, then what we really need more than anything would be a knowledge of the nature of higher hypothesis, and to be able to bring that in to the practices of statecraft and the practices of physical science. You know, the fact that you have so many people who profess to be scientists who essentially they accept the worldview and the epistemology of an Adam Smith, you know, because or a Bertrand Russell, because they don't actually incorporate the idea of that we see in Vernadsky, that we see in LaRouche's work, that the act of noesis, the human activity of the mind, discovery, right? The application of discovery, the communication of discoveries, is that which increases the productivity of everything else in the universe. You know, it allows us to turn something that is not being productive into something productive. It allows us to make, you know, to be fruitful and multiply. And that idea, which is so fundamental to our civilization, is also the root of the science of economy. But it's been perverted by this worship of Gaia and other associated syncretic, you know, cults and so forth that have been brought in largely by the British monarchy and associated groupings. You know, I mean, if you look at the effect of this guy Schellenhuber on Pope Francis and the Catholic Church in general, you know, the Catholic Church has a science advisor who thinks that the world can only handle 500 million people. So, you know, all across, in so many institutions, you have the infection of these anti-human ideas about the nature of man.
Well, I think even in that pamphlet you're talking about, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, which is a great irony there that Rosa Luxemburg her name is being used to sell degrowth, when, you know, the development of the productive forces is one of the main things she champions. But within that pamphlet, you know, they have I think early on, it's like, oh, we need 5 Earths to continue with the rate of consumption that we have right now.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's still this idea where it's like everything's preset within it, and, you know, it's something that I've done a little academic work on before, but, you know, you have something like the element uranium.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Prior to the 20th century, you know, if you're talking about like, oh, let's try to do some, you know, quick napkin write-up of what's the potential energy like within the Earth, or the Earth as an object or something like
Yes.
that. And if you're bringing uranium into it, you're like, oh, it's a rock. If you drop it, it'll have some energy. It's got some mass to it. But if you don't have both a theory of radioactivity, but then a theory of nuclear fission, which could release radioactive energy, nuclear energy, that rock, there's not an innate energy potential within it.
Yes.
It's dependent upon the technological processes and scientific understanding of it. Literally affects what it is and what it can be. So if you're not working with an idea of the mutability of substance, your substance isn't a mutable substance. You just reduce yourself to these little cartoon calculations, literally like what it is in that pamphlet.
Yes.
Cartoon calculations of like, oh, we need,
Yes.
we need 10 times as many Christs to die for our sins today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they used to use. I think they used to use uranium for stained glass, and so people would. It makes a purple dye, and so these women would use it with this close work of that type, and then they would get radiation poisoning, if I understand correctly. And no, I think that's this assumption about. I think you've hit you've pinned this question of materialism in another way, which I'm still trying to figure out, and you have a better picture of in terms of what is really meant by most people who call themselves dialectical materialists or who think from a materialist standpoint. But the idea that substances are not immutable, or what appear to be substance, in fact, but that the immutable thing is creativity per se, which can be willfully expressed by the human mind in this mode of, making a scientific discovery and then applying it to bring out another quality, another dimension, really. Because, Jason Ross does a fantastic pedagogy on the progress from sort of like mere combustion to chemistry, to the mastery of chemistry and things like metallurgy and so forth, and then to the atomic, to the control of the nucleus. For us to look at, I mean, it's natural, right, for you to look at substances in that way, what appear to be immutable objects. Of course, it's just a reflection of the view of man, because then what you're presuming is that man is also able to be counted in that way. Man is also able to be identified as having a fixed potential. Because, it's not that people deny the idea of potential, but they deny the idea that you can increase potential willfully. And so that's why, you have this outlook on Africa that is, or, the inner cities in the United States. I can't believe the degree of racism and just anti-human outlook that you get from people on the right about, and I suppose on the left too, I don't know, but these people who, like I follow this guy, and I've talked to him quite a bit, who's in Luis. He's a Puerto Rican guy. He's an ex-Marine who talks a lot about China, and I think he goes by Imperial Luis right now. And he kind of like aligns himself with that guy who keeps getting banned, Manju, the Governor General of the United States, the Chinese chauvinist.
Oh, yeah.
And I can't believe these guys who are talking about how we need to revive Western civilization or whatever. That's what they claim, right? We need to build up our country like China's building their country up. They look at China and say, what a good thing they're doing. And then they post about IQ. And they use IQ to say, well, it's clear because of the failure of development in Africa and because of the chaos in inner cities in the United States, that black people are inferior. It is the most abhorrent racism, and just foolish. They really just have no thought about the way that we what is economic development. It is not other than developing and unleashing the potential that is really infinite in the human individual mind, but doing that in a way that has an effect on the entire society.
And I think maybe an inverse of that on the left, or what might, I don't know, I'll haphazardly say could be an actually useful use of the term reverse racism that kind of happens, is something like where, because sometimes you'll get the people you talk to at the Code Pink woman or the other person at the Chow Collective event, like where they talk about, okay, at least formally we need this kind of development of Africa and this redistribution model. But I also, honestly, I find day to day more often than not, you get this, what I would say reverse racism would be, where you have this fantastic imagining, well, because if you have a sort of technological development that's developed further than Africa is in Europe and now even in China, because you have this strange, almost like, again, board game view of race, which reifies and instills race in a stronger way sometimes than even just the direct, psychological animosity. Just this, if you even interact with the idea of okay, where Europe and China right now are more technologically developed than Africa is. Africa's been underdeveloped.
Yeah.
One way that circle gets squared, you see it something that's well, that development then has to be a bad thing.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And that's where you can get the degrowth arguments. Well, because it came from, Europe, or now even with China, so everything that China's doing in Africa has to be a colonialism in a certain way as well. That it's to help Africa, we have to keep them from, getting to these uncivilized, hyper-civilized, or whatever, European and Asiatic technologies. So it's a transposition even of sort of Needham's approach to China, I'd say now to Africa, where you need to, it's something still of a noble savage mythology, I'd say. Untouched by the corruption of decadent technological progress. That's the fantasy that I think plays in the heart of this degrowth idea, where even what you were talking about was we'll just have this culture of care, which our daily lives derive around, comes from this highly racist, I would argue, mythologized idea of the uncivilized world still being in this state of noble ignorance and lack of development.
Yeah, well,
that's what we need to go to then as well.
I remember being an environmentalist, and because I was 20, 21, 22, 23, and I looked around and I was like, oh my God, the world is totally screwed up. It was absolutely insane. And Bush hadn't been put in prison, despite the fact, or at least impeached. There was no admission of the fact that we had killed so many people unjustly.
Katrina, right? A handful of other things as well.
Yeah, well, I did know the people who were victims of Katrina, and it's just, you're absolutely, you're right. But the and I said to myself, well, something is so bad, and then someone came up to me and said, well, it's because of this inherent nature of the system to destroy the earth. And I said, well, okay, I do think that there's a looming catastrophe. So the prospect that that's an ecological catastrophe, so-called, seems at least plausible. And these are the only people who are really so upset about it as I am. That's how it felt at the time. And so I started to read this, and then as I got I started to get the propaganda about the one indigenous tribe that has not yet been, contacted by the outside world, and they don't want it. They don't want it. When they shoot, arrows at the drones that come by, it shows that they absolutely want to be left alone. That's where, it's just, I mean, constantly you hear this presumption. The way that it's mouthed is, well, that's how these people like to live. I heard that at the Occupy Wall Street thing that I went to. Someone said something like, that's their way. They've been living this way for generations, for hundreds of years. Talking about people, she was explicitly attacking the idea of a Bering Strait tunnel, and saying, no, you can't build through indigenous
you
lands.
You cross the Bering Strait during an ice age, which is natural.
Anyway, but you see that constantly, that you're presuming something if you think that they want clean water.
I think the same fantasy at the heart of at least what I've seen of the land back movement right now.
Oh, talk about that.
Yeah, because it's the same thing you're talking about. You'd have to imagine that these were uncontested territories prior to the European-Colombian contact. Like, there's one good book in the 70s that was written on war in the pre-Columbian era.
Mm-hmm.
Because the indigenous American populations, they're human, like every other human population. Like that, at least historically, it's very much rooted in unfortunately, constant warfare. I think we have the potential to move beyond that, but it's been a very strong paradigm throughout the species being of humanity, and this, of course, occurred in the Americas as well. And I forget the tribes right now, but there's talk about in this one book it talks about the certain Northwest Territories in Canada and how there's literal genocides that occurred there, where then the second indigenous group took over that land. It's like, okay, so if you're talking about this Northwest Territory in Canada, you're bringing the land back, move it. Do you give it? Well, who do you give the land back to? Like the descendants of the genociders, or the less existent or basically non-existent now genocided? And I think throughout the bloody history of humanity, you're going to come back to those sort of contradictions whenever you try and trace a lineage of who rightfully owns the land. Again, you're just replicating the blood and soil terminology of any European fascist movement. I'm sure they would agree with much of that as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. I mean, there has to be the way it's done, right, is that there are these vicious crimes that are committed by empire or by oligarchism, and then people point at that and say, see, therefore, we can't have any kind of development, because the only source of development everyone knows is privation. The only source of development is slavery and crime and so forth. It's just like remarkably terrible and just doesn't go anywhere. Yeah, if you have the standard, I was kind of scared when I went to the UN General Assembly yesterday. I have to be honest, but in a good way. Well, it's not a good way, but I mean, it pricks me to do something more. I'll put it that way. Because I talked to a woman who works for the UN to solve polio, and I brought up with her what Dr. David Satcher has said, that the reason that we didn't end polio is because of the war, the fighting in Afghanistan and also in Pakistan. And I said this to her, and the woman said, actually, it has to do primarily with, and then she listed a couple of things about how the population was rejecting the polio vaccine. It's like people have been trained to miss the actual, they've just been so thoroughly trained to miss the actual issue. The benefit of man, the benefit of a population by changing the paradigm. This incredible presumption that this is just the way the world is and has been and always will be, which is totally belied by the last 20 years of China's development, first of all, if you want something recent, and not to mention by the whole characteristic of man, the whole history of man, the population chart, of course. Anyway, I think that I was scary to see the extent to which it holds people in that kind of situation. Of course, I will talk to her and we will organize her, and do everything we can to get her to look at the higher solution, which is right in front of us.
Well, ironically, in her defense, though, at least when the explicit story is that a nation's security apparatus uses the cover story of polio vaccines in order to assassinate Osama bin Laden. I
Yes,
think it's
she
and
brought that up.
understandably, I could imagine that some people were maybe more skeptical of healthcare workers coming in under those pretenses, which is why I think it is such an important mission to support from the global health system. And
Yeah,
personally, I think it needs to be put in something of a theological register, or at least it has to have something of the sacred to it, as a
yeah,
certain amount of a sacred uh, view of what humanity is. Um, and I think the sort of subtraction of that from what global healthcare currently is, where it's a weird sort of numbers game with most things, where you're trying again to ascribe like medical statistics
yeah,
to political views or something like, oh, here's it completely just devolves and profanes what is, even going back to, you don't have to do necessarily Christian metaphysics with it, but even like ancient Greece and Hippocrates.
yes,
Uh, the sort of conception of man, and I think that's even what's missing when most people respond that I've seen on Twitter or elsewhere to Helga's push for this sort of global healthcare system or world healthcare system. You mostly get a response like, "Oh well, who would be in charge of that right now? It would probably just be like Anglo-American
yeah,
Empire,
yeah, yeah,
rather than just being like a total profit-driven, like inhumane torture chambers for the most part." And if that's your limit of what's potential in a collective project, then yeah, of course, like that's what you'll imagine anything of a large scale to be, and you'll inherently just be looking for these small little enjoyments or little enclaves that you could maybe carve out until they're taken up by some larger thing that you're not really responding to in an equal kind of way.
yeah. I think that is where these endorsements from Dr. Satcher and Dr. Elders are so crucial, because what you do, I mean, it's natural that someone would have difficulty imagining that what Helga's actually saying, and I think this way absolutely. We're not. I'm not. There are people who are in the halls of power, who are in the circles of the establishment. There are people who are Americans, um, who are going to have to change their outlook. And there's not some kind of, you know, shortcut. There's going to have to be some kind of an independent political action. That,
But the thing is, though, you can't change an outlook through facts and reason and
yeah.
knowledge. Those alone,
Yes.
you can't change an outlook on that alone. And I'd say, to try and bring it back to the beginning of what you were talking about, the whole point of the poetic process.
Yes.
You need something that affects that pre-conscious
Yes.
conception of things and that sort of automatic development of a conception outside of just the rational, calculations of how to go about things.
I agree with you. So why don't we conclude now and keep that in mind and continue to try to explore that. We'll be back tomorrow night. That's on the schedule. And at that point, well, we'll discuss what we can do before then. But in the meanwhile, we can recommend to people, well, whoever's watching this. I hope Kareem is watching. That they read this. Poetry is the science of reason. The Campaigner. And we will look. We'll look towards other projects as well. Some necessary projects in the present period. Okay, so good night.
I'm good. Have a good night.